Hi everybody. So I figured I would make this. I don't know if I'm gonna make it like a series. I guess it's gonna kind of like be dependent on how much I talk about in this video, because basically the first video I did about this was kind of like an introduction to cohorts and kind of like how that basically limits the understanding that Latin people have for each other, right? And this is, again, when I'm speaking about this, I'm really speaking in regards to Americanized Latin people. I may touch on foreign Latin people here and there in this video too, to kind of give a little, reference here and there. But this is really, more so on us right now. So with regards to cohorts, right? I know in the last video that I gave examples of people, like, let's say, migrating in the 80s, and how that would be, how they would view the world would be very different to how I would view the world, right? When it comes to terms of Latin unity, Latin people, and even what it means to be a quote unquote American, right? So I use myself as an example a lot, because number one, it's one of the easier things for me to do. But I also think that people like me are kind of a good test study for these types of things. So in this, I kind of wanted to touch on what are the aspects that people like to make fun of me on here all the time with, which is the lack of the Spanish language, right? And I kind of want to get into that, and how even just with that alone, how you can see how the vast difference it is in thinking that people like my parents had in comparison to a lot of other Latin people who are the same age range. And the reason why I don't speak Spanish, okay? I had asked both of my parents different times. I was like, well, why didn't you ever teach me, right? So the reasonings that they would always give me, which I've spoken about this before in videos. Yes, both of my parents speak fluent Spanish. When my parents were going to school, they didn't really, when they first went to school, they knew some English, but they mostly knew Spanish. Why? Because my grandparents didn't speak any English. Okay. So when at that time, you're talking about, when they were like in kindergarten and when they were very young, they were going to school during, like, before the civil rights movement began. So you're talking about things were really racially segregated at that time. And the discrimination was really bad. And their teachers would abuse them for speaking Spanish. Other students would abuse them for speaking Spanish. They would tell them that this is America and, they're basically supposed to speak English, right? Which led to a certain level of trauma for my parents. And it not only did it lead to a certain level of trauma, but when I asked my parents about why they didn't really teach me the language, is because they said that they didn't feel that it was important. So holding on to the language for people like my parents, because they are the boomer generation and they were American. My parents were born and raised here. So my parents are from the boomer generation. I will be getting into the boomer generation, by the way. I will be talking about that, because they really dropped the ball. Right now I'm just talking about the language, and that's not even that big of a thing. In comparison to some of the other things that the boomer generation has done, holy crap, the language is nothing, okay? But I know for a lot of Latin people that they get very hell-bent on this, and some of them, especially foreign Latin people, or even Latin people that may be in the same age range as my parents. However, they weren't born and raised here, so they still have their, the country of origin that they came from. They still have those types of ideologies from different parts of Latin America. So they're still holding on to cultural customs, norms, the language, and all of that they find very important. Whereas with my parents' generation, they were taught to assimilate. And assimilate meaning assimilate to white America. And what turns out to be, that was where I ended up, right? Regardless of me growing up in the hood, in Bushwick, Brooklyn, during the crack era, drugs and alcohol everywhere, Growing up, seeing domestic violence, seeing drug abuse, seeing all of that stuff in my home, still in the end, I managed to to basically end up living in a predominantly white neighborhood. Why? Because that was how I was raised to be assimilated. Now, those types of things did cause conflict for me to a degree, because my parents wanted me to assimilate to white American culture, while simultaneously being too poor to live in a white community. So I grew up still in a black and brown community, however, being very whitewashed. And my case is not like an isolated one. There are other Latin people out there that are similar to me. I know that there's other Latin people from different parts of Latin America who are also losing the language and stuff like that. Like, I hear it more now, like those type of complaints from like Dominican Americans who may be my generation now. So they may be the younger generation, but they're third generation and they're losing more of the language and whatnot. Maybe not to the degree that Puerto Ricans did, but I do hear those complaints, right? And I think that that's not something that a lot of people, if their parents weren't born and raised here at that time the way my parents were, they're not going to understand the reasoning as to why there's people like me, why there's Latin people like me who are basically stripped of the language. Okay? So if they migrated here, after that, they're not going to have that understanding. And I guess I wouldn't expect them to. Like, there's times that I wish that they would try to be more understanding, but at the same time, it's like, look, like, people like me can't be here for, like, we can tell you how things were for us, how things were for our parents, but if you want to understand it, then fine, and if you don't, then fine. And in most cases, they're not going to, because a lot of Latin people like to use that as a means to feel superior over people like myself, who are whitewashed and who are more Americanized. So they like to use that as a way to feel better. They like to use that as a means to feel superior, and they do that a lot. And they like to do it in insulting ways. It happens to me on YouTube all the time, so I'm used to it already. And it's a shame, but it is what it is. And you kind of get, it's not even that you kind of get used to it, you do get used to it. And if people have gotten too stupid with me face to face, I have snapped at people before. So that's something totally, that's a whole different story for a different day. Because being afraid of these people, I'm not. That's definitely not the case. So at the end of the day, I still am very much a hood chick. It's still in me. I do my best to curb those things, but that's another thing. The whole idea of being Americanized, right? And what I hear a lot from generations that are younger than me, like the millennials, for example, is the whole idea of being American is something that they refuse to take part in. They refuse because of different reasons. They feel as though this country does not accept them as being American, and certain things that they believe that they went through, certain levels of discrimination or whatnot that they believe that they went through, and they use that as a means to not, be like, okay, no, I'm not American. Whatever their reasoning is, I guess fair enough, right? But it's still not the actuality. It's still not the reality. If you leave this country, and even if you're born and raised here, even if you still have some connections to your family's homeland, that's not going to mean anything to the people in the other countries that you go visit. They're still going to look at you like an American, point blank period, whether you like it or not. Once you start, speaking that King's English, that's it, And even when you speak Spanish in a certain way, they might be like, no, you're an American, right? And it is what it is. Now, there's a lot of people that really don't take pride in that. And I really see that within the younger generations. And the reasons why my generations, and maybe generations before me, that are Latin, that do take pride in it, is because of the things that we've overcome, because of the hurdles that we've overcome in this country. So there is a sense of pride, and we don't give a goddamn if, white people may not see you as an American. Like, I'm not here to live by what white people believe. It doesn't matter what they believe. I'm still here, and I'm still an American, and I'm still a citizen, point blank, period. So what they believe is irrelevant, basically. But other younger people, I kind of feel like, in a way, give more power to them, and give more power to people on the outside with that, with regards to, oh, you don't accept us as an American, so, and you don't treat us right, so therefore I'm stripping myself of that, and I'm saying that I'm an other. It's like, all right, they're just going to be like, all right, whatever, you're still here, so it doesn't matter. Just do your job and shut up. They don't really care. And I have noticed that a lot with the younger generations in comparison to the older generations. And I know that to some people that might be kind of a more conservative leaning type way of thinking, and maybe it is. But I know that at one time even I was like that a little bit, when I was in my younger years, when I was in my more like pro-Latin, I guess you would say pro-blackish type way of thinking, and I think that even when I had my other channel, my channel prior to this is probably why I get accused of calling myself black, because I was more on the pro-black side leaning. Maybe not so much as some other people on here. I wasn't to that extreme, but I was way more than I am now, and it's because I've seen the light of things, and I see things differently now. I've learned a lot now, and I've come to the realization that, while my experiences are the same, and I can, very similar to, like, let's say the Black American experience, and I can acknowledge that, at the same time, I know that the Black American community overall is not going to be like, you're just like us either. You know what I mean? Because to a degree, no, I'm not, because they weren't necessarily whitewashed to the degree that I was. Some people may argue differently, but I would say no, that I'm not, that I am different, and it's fine. I don't think it's something bad. But as far as trauma and things like that, yes, the similarities are very the same. And it's not to say that there wasn't, drugs and alcohol and all types of violence in Latin America, because we all know that there is. But I guess what I'm saying is that with the times it was more different, because in this country everything was so racialized, and maybe in Latin America those things were not necessarily there when it came to like the drugs and all of the crime and all of that. Things are very different when it comes to that regard. So, and then there's like a whole thing with when it comes to, the crack era and stuff like that, and how the drugs got into the neighborhoods, and there's a whole, different argument about that those drugs were planted there, which I do believe. But again, that's a whole other story for a different day. But I think I'm going to leave this for now, just like this. I might get into like, the boomer generations and stuff like that, and millennials and Gen Xers, and just kind of how our worldviews are so completely different when it comes to being Latin. And so one other thing I want to say before I go: while I believe that Latin unity may not be a thing necessarily like in my lifetime or this part of my life, I do believe that in this country that it definitely can happen if it's projected by the year 2040 that this country is basically going to be a predominantly Latin country. If that happens, then yes, I do believe it can happen. Okay? But that's not the case right now, so that's why I'm like, I don't know if it's going to happen right now. But I do have hope for the future. All right, so I think that's about it, and I'm going to go for now, and I'll see you guys in my next one. Bye.